Hello and welcome back. If you've been following along, I think we're in a really good place to jump into the Gospels. We can understand the Gospels and the New Testament with the foundation we have. If you haven't listened to everything up till now, I do recommend you at least go back and listen to the recap in the previous lesson. It kind of sets the background for everything that we're going to talk about in the New Testament here. So, New Testament begins in one of the most exciting possible ways, a genealogy, a big long list of names. And that was extremely common, especially this part of the world at this point in history, because your identity as a human being had everything to do with your family line, forward and backward. And if you're writing about somebody saying, here's what you need to know about this person, you almost always begin early on in your writing with the genealogy, because that defines who the person is. Matthew and Luke both have genealogies, and we're going to look briefly at those. We're not going to study every single name, but there are some really actually interesting things in that big long list of hard to pronounce names. And most people ignore Mark and John as far as genealogies because nothing is there. But actually, it's pretty profound if you really stop and think about this. So those of you with a background in the Bible may be interested in this. So again, the genealogy defines who you are. Now, in Matthew's gospel, Matthew is trying to show his readers, who are primarily Jewish, that Jesus is their king. And he does that in two ways. One, he points right through his genealogy from the very beginning to Jesus as a descendant of David, qualifying him to be Messiah. And Messiah, by the way, the word Messiah means anointed one. And I'll review this again in a couple of sessions, I'm sure. But basically, when somebody's anointed as king, they become known as the anointed one. It started with the priesthood, and then when the kings became active, it went to the kings. But a king is an anointed one. So when you are anointed to be the king, you are the anointed one. And the prophets are all talking about this anointed one in the line of David, who would come and rescue the Jewish people from their enemies and create peace in the world, overthrow their enemies. Everything will be good again. All the nations of the earth will come and worship him, and the Lord will reign in heaven, and this king will reign in Jerusalem, and life is good. So this is the anointed one, and the word is Messiah. It's also in the English word Messiah comes from a Hebrew word Mashiach, and the Greek form of that is Christos, which is the English word Christ. So Messiah and Christ literally mean the same thing. So when you talk about Jesus Christ, Christ wasn't his last name. So his parents were not Mr. and Mrs. Christ, and he was Jesus Christ. Christ is his title. So it would be Jesus the King, Jesus Christ, Jesus Messiah, Christ Jesus, right? All are exactly the same. It means Jesus the King. So Matthew's presenting Jesus as king. Mark tends to present Jesus as a servant. The servant of God came to serve human beings. Luke is a physician, and as a physician, he's very interested in humanity and the human elements of Jesus. And he presents Jesus as a human being, and his genealogy is traced all the way back to Adam, who he calls the Son of God. So he's really interested in, God created Adam as a human being, and then the human line, right up to Jesus. And then John is interested in presenting Jesus as divine, as the Son of God, or as God himself. And Jesus makes several claims to be God. And John's gospel is the one that points to these things far more actively, far more powerfully than the other Gospels. So John is presenting Jesus as God himself. All right, so think about the genealogies then. Matthew traces Jesus' genealogy. He starts out saying the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, remember, Jesus the King, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And he's establishing Jesus' credentials to be this king in the line of David right from there. And he starts from Abraham then and gives a genealogy. He doesn't include every single person. It's fine in this culture, if you skip generations here and there. He's doing it intentionally. But he's trying to make the point that here's the flow, right from Abraham to David to Jesus. And he ends up with Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called the Christ. And he goes on to explain why he does that, why he makes that jump. So Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born the Christ, the King. So in doing that, he traces Jesus' legal lineage from Abraham all the way to Joseph, the father of Jesus. And then he kind of jumps over to Mary, and there's Jesus born of Mary. All right, but there's this little nuance in the law. And I think, now I can't prove this, right? So take it for what it's worth. But I think, and I'm very, very convinced of this, in the law, the Torah, basically, if you're a man, you have an inheritance, you have a land inheritance, and your existence, your identity is carried on by your family line. So if you have a son, that son will carry on your identity after you die. And you live on by having male children. And your land goes to your children, and as they have children and they have children and they have children, the family expands, it turns into a city. And usually, it's very rare that anybody would leave your family and move somewhere else. So as this is happening then, these cities are forming. And if you don't have children, you're considered cursed, because your family line, your portion at least of the family line, will lose that land. And you have no identity after you die. You're considered cursed because you cease to exist. So there was a couple things in the law. One, there's a thing called the kinsman redeemer, which is very important throughout the Bible. And this basically says, if a man dies, if I die and I don't have if I don't have any children, well, then my brother, the next in line, will marry my wife and have a child through her on my behalf. And that child becomes legally my child who carries on my line and will also carry on my portion of the family inheritance. That was a really important part of the law. And another little nuance was somebody came to Moses and said, hey, I do have children. I have a bunch of children, but all of them are female. They're all girls. What happens when I die? I lose my land. Everything is gone. And so after some discussion and prayer and, Moses talking with God, they created a little nuance in the law, in the Torah, basically saying what happens is this: if you have all girls, then as your girls marry, usually the girl would go into another family and produce an heir for that family line. Well, in this case, that woman, when she marries, her father will have legally adopted her husband, the girl's husband. That way, the girl's husband becomes his legal son and carries on his family line for him. Right? What does that have to do with the Gospels? Well, here, Joseph would be legally would be Jesus' father. But if you look carefully at these lists, a lot of times we just kind of look at a few names and say, oh, don't make me do this, and we skip over it. But when you compare Matthew and his genealogy to Luke's genealogy, the names are completely different. And it looks like a huge contradiction. Like, don't we know who these people's names are? Because there's almost nothing in common here. Well, Luke, the physician, who's interested in the humanity of Jesus, sees that little nuance in the law. And I think what happened was this. I suspect that Mary's father had only woman, possibly only Mary. So when he died, his identity would cease to exist. He would lose his land inheritance. He would then have adopted Joseph to be his legal son. Even though Joseph was older, Joseph becomes his legal heir, his son. And because of that, then, Luke traces the genealogy this way. He says Jesus, when he began his ministry, was about 30 years of age, being the son, as it was supposed, of Joseph, the son of Haley. Well, in Matthew's gospel, we find out that Jacob was the father of Joseph. So which is it? Is Joseph's father Jacob or Haley? Well, Haley would be Mary's father, who would have legally adopted Joseph. So Jesus was the son of Joseph. Joseph was the son of Haley, Mary's father. And then we trace Mary's line all the way back to Adam. right? So very different genealogies, because Luke is tracing his human line, his bloodline, where Matthew is tracing his legal line. So Luke is showing Jesus as the human, Matthew is showing Jesus legally as the heir to the throne of David. Well, in doing this, Matthew does some really fascinating things. I find them fascinating, at least. Maybe I need to get out more. I don't know. But here he starts out saying Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. And then every Jew reading this would say, wait, stop. What did you just say? So Matthew did something extremely unusual and a little bit hard to understand at first. First, he mentioned two men, and then he mentioned Tamar, a woman. There's a woman in this genealogy. You hardly ever see that in this culture. Why would there be a woman? And why that woman? And so we need to kind of refresh ourselves in that story a little bit. So we get to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Judah. Well, Judah, he was one of the ones who came up with this brilliant idea of killing his brother Joseph. And so way back in Genesis, if you don't remember this, you can look this up. Judah and his brothers, they hated Joseph. There was a lot of favoritism in the family. It was not a good, healthy, model church family by any stretch of imagination. And they hated Joseph. Judah was one of the ones who, when Joseph came out to just kind of check up on them, they captured him, took his robe off, very recognizable robe. It was the father's favorite son, and made this special robe for him. They took that robe off and threw him in a cistern, really, really deep pit that was there to collect water. Well, here's Joseph in the cistern, and they decided, the whole group of them, let's not kill him, because we get nothing from that except we have to explain it to our father. Instead, let's sell him into slavery. That way we get a little cash for him. And there was a band of traders coming by, and it's a little unclear whether they went and fetched him and brought him to the traders and traded him, or whether there were two groups of traders. One found him and sold him to the other. Right? Either way, Joseph was traded into slavery on his way to Egypt, which usually is a death sentence. You end up in the mines, working in the caves. You die either of an accident or of illness from all the fumes. So the brothers, as far as they knew, whatever happened there, they were responsible, and Joseph would be on his way to probably a very painful death. And they brought back the cloak to their father and told him that they found the cloak. They covered it with animal blood, told him they found the cloak. Well, his father was grieving and he never went through the stages of grief, the cycle of grieving. He never did it. He just could not get past his favorite son, who he loved with everything in him, was dead. And Judah ended up leaving. And you don't leave your family, like, ever. Judah left. And I think it's because he knew he was one of the key people in what happened to Joseph. And every day he got up and saw the agony in his father's eyes, and he couldn't handle the guilt. So he left. And he left and went to another city, and he got married. He had 3 sons. And the first son got older, and he got married. But Genesis says that he did something that displeased the Lord. We're not told what. And God struck him dead. So the second son then was required to take the first son's wife. He was required to go marry her, sleep with her, and have a child on behalf of the first son. Well, instead, he took his deceased older brother's wife and fooled around with her and enjoyed her and had a lot of fun with her, but would not get her pregnant. He would, practice a form of birth control, I guess you could say, and didn't get her pregnant. Just refused to do it. And that displeased the Lord, and so the Lord struck him down. And then here's Judah saying, I don't know what this woman is doing to my kids, but 2 of them are dead. She's not touching the third one. So Judah says, look, just go live with your family for a while. My third son is too young to marry. When he's old enough, I'll send for you and we'll arrange the marriage. Now, legally, she would be considered married to him already. The covenant would be in place. and if she slept with anybody, then it would be adultery. Well, Judah had no intention at all of ever letting them marry. So he just kind of let her, you know, live with her parents and hope that she just kind of forgot about everything, like that's going to happen. Well, one day, years later, she just has accepted that it's not going to happen. So she takes matters into her own hands. So she knows there's a feast, and she knows that Judah will be taking some of his crops up to this feast to make some money. It's a big celebration, and you trade and barter and everything. So she dresses up like a prostitute, and she goes out and seduces Judah. And Judah seems almost hesitant at first, and then just kind of says, okay, and says, I have no cash, but here, I'll give you my staff. You hold my staff. That's like, you know, kind of like, here's my credit card. And when I return, I'll give you the money because I'll be selling some of my crops, and then I'll have money, I'll pay you and get my staff back, right? So that's the arrangement they make. He sleeps with her. He doesn't realize that it's Tamar. He thinks he's just sleeping with some prostitute. She's got a veil over her face and everything, and he hasn't seen her in a long, long time. So he goes home. A couple months later, he gets word that Tamar, his daughter-in-law, is pregnant. And he says, oh, good, that's great news, because now she's an adulteress and she'll be stoned, and I don't have to worry about her marrying my son and killing him somehow. So she sends a message to him saying, yes, it's true, I am pregnant by the one who owns this staff. And the messengers hand him his credit card back. They hand him his staff back, and he realizes, that's my staff. Oh, she was that prostitute. She deceived me. He realizes the whole thing. He gets it. And he falls on his knees. And instead of being furious with her, he says, she is more righteous than I am. And the next thing we know, he's back with his family. He's with Jacob and all his brothers again. So Judah did all this. Well, the children that were born by this woman, Tamar, were Perez and Zerah. So Matthew didn't just say Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, Perez, and keep going. Matthew went out of his way to say Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Judah, who thought he was sleeping with a prostitute, but instead was committing adultery with his daughter-in-law, that Tamar, and that Judah, right, goes out of his way to do this. Why on earth, if he's trying to make a case that Jesus is Messiah, why on earth would he include this in the genealogy? Well, then he goes on. Perez was the father of Hezron. Hezron was the father of Ram. Ram the father of Aminadab. Aminadab the father of Nahshon. Nahshon the father of Salmon. Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab. Well, who's Rahab, and why is he mentioning another girl? Why is Matthew mentioning another woman here? Well, Rahab, turns out, when the people came out of Egypt and God sent them to Jericho to take the city, destroy the city, they sent spies into Jericho, and the spies logically went right to the house of a prostitute. Why? Use your imagination, I guess. I don't know. Well, they went to this prostitute. That was Rahab, the prostitute. In Hebrew, the word can mean prostitute or innkeeper. But in the Greek, when she's mentioned in the Greek, it specifically uses a Greek word for prostitute. So maybe she was an innkeeper, but not like the Holiday Inn, different kind of inn that she was an innkeeper of. But no, she was, by definition, in the Greek, a prostitute. Boaz ends they save Rahab. Rahab spares these two spies. Their lives are at stake. She protects them and spares them. And they make a deal with her that they'll spare her when they go in and take Jericho. She ends up, after the battle, they do take her, they rescue her, and she ends up living with the Jews, and she ends up marrying Boaz. So here's this prostitute Rahab. Not only is she part of this genealogy, but Matthew goes out of his way to include her, the second woman, in a genealogy that usually would not contain women. And the first one we heard about, the second one now is a prostitute. Well, Boaz, who married her, was the father of Obed by Ruth, another woman. what is Matthew doing? And Ruth was an awesome woman, right? She was a great woman, but she came from Moab. She was a Moabite. And God refers to Moab in the Psalms. There are two different Psalms that refer to Moab as God's wash basin. It could mean like a sink, something to wash your hands in. It could mean something to wash your feet in, and your feet get filthy. You wear sandals in that part of the world and in that culture, and your feet get filthy. So it's like this incredibly dirty, gross washing system for your feet. But it could also mean bedpan or toilet, which I'm going with because, toilet. God basically calls Moab his toilet. This is God's toilet. Ruth she's an awesome woman, but she's that woman from God's toilet. And in the Torah, God says nobody descended from a Moabite will enter into my assembly. It's kind of like saying, if you're descended from a Moabite, you can't go to church. You can't enter our church because you're descended from a Moabite. Nobody can enter my assembly. Well, Obed was born by the relationship between Boaz and Ruth, this woman from God's toilet. Well, Obed became the father of Jesse. Jesse became the father of David the king. And here we are, King David, the best king Israel has had, highly esteemed. Messiah comes from David's line. Finally, we get past all that stuff with these, shady women and the relationships there. We get to David the king. And then Matthew continues, David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. What? He mentions Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah. Why on earth would Matthew do this now? So David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. And if you remember that part of the narrative, David stayed home from the battle, sent Joab out on the battlefield. He stayed back for the first time, and he was wandering around bored, and he looked out. He was on the roof of his palace, and a lot of the wealthier families would have private baths on the roof. And it's meant to be private. So this woman, Bathsheba, she was bathing, cleansing herself of her monthly impurity, meaning she was fertile, she could have babies. Well, David, on the roof of his palace, started, he took out his binoculars and started enjoying the view and ended up calling for her. And when the king calls for you and says, have dinner with me, you kind of don't say no, right? This is completely, like, it wasn't like they knew each other and had some romance going or something like that. It wasn't that at all. David didn't even know who she was. He had to ask people who she was. And he was told, she is the wife of Uriah, one of your fighting men, one of David's best, group of best fighting men. And David didn't care. He just sent for her. They had dinner together, watched Netflix for a while, got cozy. And really, at best here, this pretty much David is abusing his power as king, and at best it's sexual harassment. You could consider it even rape or date rape. Now, was Bathsheba willing? I mean, she probably wouldn't refuse because David's the king, but I don't think she was, like some people say she was trying to seduce David. I don't buy that for a second. I mean, this was all David calling for her, and he's king. Like, you really don't refuse the king. So could she have said no? Yeah, yes, but, right? I don't fault her for this really at all. David should have known better. He knew the guy who was her husband, right? Shouldn't have happened. So he blatantly just took advantage of his position and slept with her. And then she got pregnant by David, and David covered it up by murdering her husband. He had her husband killed. So here, Matthew is going out of his way again. It's like we finally get to David, the king, the man after God's heart, this great man of God. And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. Why on earth would Matthew do all this? Well, let's pause. He ends here. He ends the genealogy with Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Messiah or Christ. Well, he's acknowledging here that Mary, was not with Joseph, and everybody would have known this. So imagine you have this girls would marry roughly age 13, give or take a year. Usually, guys would marry in their late teens. Some people say Joseph was quite a bit older, maybe had even been married before. I don't have any idea. But Mary was probably a very young girl. So imagine this like 13, 14-year-old girl in your church youth group showing up one day saying, "I'm pregnant." And everybody looks at her shocked. Like, you're 13. How could you, like, what were you thinking? Who's the guy? Who's the father? And she says, "Oh, no, no, don't worry. It was God who did this to me." Right? How would people react to that? Nobody's going to believe that. And that's pretty much what happened to Mary. So, according to the Gospels, the Holy Spirit came upon Mary and made her pregnant. And Joseph had nothing to do with it. Well, what are the rumors going to be about her? She would be at an age where she's fertile, which means she would have her monthly period. The woman in this culture would all hang out together all day, doing certain work. They had certain roles and they'd be together a lot. And when they would bathe, they go to the ceremonial bathing. And when women are together frequently, day after day, week after week, month after month, their cycles end up lining up. So a lot of the women would have been having their periods at the same time and then would have been cleansing themselves at the same time. And so here they are, 1 month, they all go to the mikvah, the bath, and they're cleansing themselves, and Mary's not there. They don't think much of it. And the next month, Mary's not there again. And the next month, Mary's not there again. And then she starts to get a little belly. I mean, you can only hide that for so long in this culture. So they all know. And everybody knows everything about everybody, especially in small towns like Nazareth, where Mary was living. But it would spread way beyond Nazareth. Anybody who knew anyone is going to be talking about this. So Mary had quite the reputation. Plus Joseph, who was pledged to be married to her. The covenant had been made. They weren't married yet officially, but the covenant had been made. So if Mary sleeps with somebody else, it is legally considered adultery. She should be put to death for that, according to the Torah. Well, Joseph finds out that she's pregnant, and can you imagine that conversation? "Joseph, I'm pregnant, but it's okay. I wasn't sleeping with anybody, I promise." Right? How is Joseph going to react to this? Well, he loved Mary. He didn't want to have her killed. He didn't want her to bear the public shame any more than she had to, and he decided to divorce her quietly. And an angel came and told Joseph, "This really genuinely is from the Lord. You need to go through with the marriage," and he did. Well, what are all the rumors going to be? Right? Here's this young woman who's pregnant outside of marriage, and her husband, who she's pledged to be married, still marries her. Well, maybe he got her pregnant. Maybe it was just they did that, they made the covenant, but they weren't married, so it would be still frowned upon. Fornication is technically what it is. But most likely, he denies any involvement, and he was going to divorce her after all, so it sounds like she was with another guy. Right? And that's the reputation she maintained all throughout her life. Mary had that reputation all through her life, and we'll see that in a few weeks as Jesus is arguing with some of the religious leaders. That comes back. So here Matthew is saying, I know a lot of people say Jesus cannot be Messiah. He cannot be the king because he was born of an adulterous relationship. And he basically says, yeah, I'll talk about that later. And he does. He tells the story. But first he says, if you're going to disqualify Jesus just because his mom has a reputation of adultery, you think he's an illegitimate child. Well, let's look at the history. We have Abraham, who did some shady stuff himself, but Matthew doesn't go into that. But Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, and then Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Remember Judah, who slept with Tamar, his daughter-in-law? Right? This is Judah. And then we get Hezron, Ram, Nishan, Salmon, and then Boaz was born by Rahab the prostitute. And after Boaz, who was born by a prostitute, Boaz was the father of Obed by Ruth, that woman from God's toilet. Obed, the father of Jesse, the father of David. But wait, Remember what David did. Uh, Solomon was king after him. Solomon was born of Bathsheba. Remember that one who David committed adultery with and then murdered to cover it up? Matthew's bringing all of this up to say, if you're going to disqualify Jesus because there's a shady relationship in his family line, because his mom did this thing, well, remember what Judah did. Remember that David is in the line of Judah. And then remember Rahab, the prostitute, is in the line of David. Ruth, that Moabite girl, is in the line of David. David wasn't even supposed to go into the assembly of the Lord because the law about the Moabites descended from a Moabite. And then David himself, if you're going to disqualify Jesus because his mother committed adultery, well, what about David committing adultery with Bathsheba and then killing Uriah? If you're going to disqualify Jesus, you have to disqualify David himself, and God certainly didn't do that. So Matthew, in this genealogy, is challenging every opposition to Jesus by people who would be adamantly opposed to Mary herself. And then Matthew goes on to describe the birth of Jesus in quite a bit of detail. Matthew and Luke both do that. So in the next session, we'll pick up talking about more objections to Jesus as Messiah. We'll see what Jesus did growing up, and we'll see when he actually began his ministry as a rabbi and all the healings and miracles he started doing, and then the people's reaction to Jesus, leading up to that big question, could he actually be our king?